Hi everyone, I'm Justine Woolf and I am the Director of Consulting at Innecto. Just to draw your attention to the QR code, if you want a copy of the slides and other papers that we've pulled together, you can go to that landing page and you'll find information on there. And if you want to talk to me at any point today, it can be found on the personal group stand, which is stand number 20. So, we've seen a lot of talk about pay transparency and the need to comply with legislation over the last few years. And some of it might apply to you already, some of it will apply to you in the future. But how do you get your organisation ready without that legislative push? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to cover the EU Pay Transparency in a little bit of detail, but then also talk about why it's still important to take note if it doesn't apply to your organisation. What kind of things you need to be thinking about and how you take your leaders and your managers on that journey. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes and then I'm going to be joined by Alison, Hanlan and Judith Moore from WISE, and we'll have a masterclass and you'll be able to answer some questions. So, we've seen increasing amounts of legislation implemented over the last few years, and it varies across the world and it differs country to country. But ultimately, it's aiming to address and alleviate pay disparities. So this trend of global cross-pollination of pay equity laws is one of the reasons why people are taking pay transparency more seriously. So if we look in the US, over the last decade or so, there's been various laws enacted in different states. And it's all about promoting pay transparency. So the aim is very much to help employees feel more informed about the roles they're applying for, but also to feel empowered to negotiate salaries. And that all contributes to reductions in wage gaps. And whilst the details vary from state to state, there's kind of three broad themes. They're around sort of the disclosure of pay ranges for job postings, the disclosure of total comp for employees, but also salary history bands. And we're now seeing some of these measures adopted in the EU. So the EU Pay Transparency Directive was passed in 2023, and it comes into force in 2026. And its main focus is to give employees new rights to information and also to require companies to show that where they've got gaps, what they're doing to address them. So the slide gives you some of the key measures, but in essence, job applicants will have the right to receive pay information for the roles they're applying for. Employees are going to be able to ask for how their individual salary compares to salaries at the same level, average salaries at the same level, sorry. Employers are going to have to share descriptions of the criteria that they're using for pay decisions and career progression. And they're also going to have to show that where they've got gaps, gender pay gaps of more than 5% when you're comparing categories of worker that can't be justified objectively, what are they going to do to close their gaps? They're going to have to carry out joint pay assessments and show what they're going to actually do to close those gaps. And when we think about it, 5% is not very much. On a salary of 30,000, we're talking, what, £1,500? So it's not very much at all. And whilst we've known about these measures in practice for about 18 months now, there is still a huge amount of ambiguity about what they're going to mean in practice. So there was a paper that Towers and others produced. Hopefully you can see on the thing and you can Google it. It's not a very long one, but it's quite interesting because it's aimed at member states and things that they need to be taking into account when they're transposing the law into local legislation. And the aim is to clarify a number of the terms and requirements that are quite vague in the directive. So it talks about categories of worker, for example. So the question on everyone's lips is, well, how do you define a category of worker? And what flexibility are employers going to have to determine that? Do you have to have a job evaluation framework, or is generic levels going to be sufficient? Well, the directive itself actually makes reference to the need to assess the value of work using objective criteria. So it does sound like job evaluation frameworks are going to be needed, particularly analytical ones, and that is going to be a change required for organisations that have got a job architecture but maybe it's not underpinned by an analytical job evaluation methodology. The other thing that's referenced in the directive is that the concept of pay is quite broad. So we're used to, in the UK, doing gender pay gap reporting on base pay and bonus, but actually pay as covered under the directive covers things like benefits and pensions. So again, there's a lot of questions at the moment. What do we actually need to report, and where are we going to get this information from? Now, the tricky part to all of this is that every country is going to be transposing this legislation locally. So they're going to have to make sure they meet the minimum requirements of the directive. But whilst the aim of the directive is to create similar standards and consistency across the EU, it's likely that we'll see some differences between countries. So if we take the thresholds for reporting gender pay gap, for example, the EU Pay Transparency Directive states that employers over 100 employees would be required to do gender pay gap reporting. But some countries already have thresholds below that. So in France, in Italy, Ireland from next year, their thresholds are 50 employees and above. So it's quite likely we're going to see different permutations of implementation from country to country. Now, at the moment, there's only been one country, so one region in Belgium has transposed the legislation, and Sweden have published a draft of what they plan to do, but actually nobody has actually transposed this legislation into law yet. So we still don't know exactly what it means. Interestingly, though, both Belgium and Sweden have talked about additional requirements. So they've included a requirement to look at male and female progression based on parental leave and comparing that to others that haven't taken the same leave. So whilst the directive gives us minimums, it may be that there will be additional requirements that countries individually may add on to their legislation. Now, it only applies to the 27 countries in the EU. So exposure in the UK is currently limited unless you've got operations across Europe. But it is already raising expectations of employees, of candidates, of suppliers about levels of transparency. And it's putting more pressure on employers to be more transparent if they want to stay competitive in the market. And I think we're probably likely to see a number of employers voluntarily adopt some of these measures, so they'll go above what's going to be required in the UK, particularly if they're global and they want to keep a one business footprint. Now, in the UK, we've obviously got gender pay gap reporting, and the gap has been reducing, albeit at a glacial pace. There is definitely more work to be done, and we've heard in the King's speech in the summer that there's going to be a greater focus on improving equal pay. So we're going to see new reporting requirements for ethnicity and disability coming online soon. Now, we don't have all the details, but it does look like the new Equalities Bill is also going to include a requirement for employers of over 250 employees to develop, publish and implement action plans to show how they are changing and reducing their pay gaps. So there is going to be more required of all of you. And even though the legislation in the UK isn't as progressive as that in the EU, it doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. We're seeing a change in societal expectations. So younger employees are far more open to the idea of pay transparency than their older colleagues are and were used to in terms of the way that they've been working. And companies are already starting to get on that front foot voluntarily. So it's just data from a Towers survey that showed that, employers in the UK are starting to ramp up their activities when it comes to pay transparency. And boards are taking an interest too. So remuneration committees are increasingly focusing on the wider employee population. And they may already be asking you, have you got pay equity? And if you haven't, what are you doing to move the dial and make some progress? Now, there's lots of evidence that shows pay transparency in the workplace is the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do, but it also leads to improved satisfaction, morale, and employees are more likely to feel that they're paid fairly. And when we trust that we're paid fairly, we're more productive, we're more engaged, And our businesses benefit from that because they get boosted reputations and potentially profits. And it gives employers a recruitment advantage as well. So there's data that shows employers who show their salary ranges on job ads get twice as many clicks and 6 times as many applicants than those that don't. So bearing in mind the search for talent is global and not local, you could be missing out if you're not being more transparent. But moving that dial is proving to be quite hard. So even with this business case for change, increased pressure coming from legislation and from society, a lot of people are saying they want change, but actually getting them to lead that change is a bit tricky. Now, I'm sure some of you will recognise this model. It was introduced by Kubler-Ross, and it illustrates our individual responses to all kinds of change. So apologies if this is triggering for anybody. I've adapted it. So this is my take on the pay transparency curve through the eyes of an HR reward professional. And from conversations I've been having with people is that a lot of people are stuck in that dip at the moment. They're stuck in frustration and depression because they're overwhelmed with day-to-day activity and there's not really getting much traction and appetite from the business. So interested to know where you all are in this curve. So who's on that left-hand side and still in shock and denial about the idea of pay transparency? No one? Okay. Who's in the dip? Who's coming out the other side? A few. Okay, that's good to see. Wherever you are now, it's probably different to where others are in your organisation. So we need to think about not just our own journey, but how we take others with us. And I think one of the issues we're seeing at the moment is there's a bit of a disconnect between HR and the C-suite. So this survey from Lattice showed that over half of HR respondents said that their execs weren't really on board with the idea of pay transparency. And one of the reasons people are finding it hard to get traction is that as a cohort, and this is a bit of a generalisation, but the survey sort of illustrates this, is that they're less convinced that greater openness is going to make everyone's lives better. They also tend to feel happier about the status quo. And one reason for that might be that exec pay has risen at a far faster rate than the average pay for most workers. But there's also a level of hesitancy that comes along with this because when you go to do pay transparency, there's a lot of public explaining that needs to happen. So, you know, when you've got little practice or you don't really understand what's driving the gaps in your organisation, you might prefer to just not open that can of worms. So how do we build confidence with our execs that transparency is the right thing to do? Sorry. So we need to start by working with our senior leadership teams. What are the challenges you're facing as a business? And how could your organisation benefit directly from being more transparent? How does it fit with your vision and your values? Because that can really help convince leaders that it's the right thing to do for your organisation. But we need to define what we mean by pay transparency. Everyone has different views on what it is. And for some, it will be, oh, we've got to show everything. You don't. It might be you share pay ranges. Maybe you share market data. It might be it's an iterative process. You don't have to go from 0 to 100 in one go. But what you do need to do is build trust with your leaders by improving their understanding of what we mean by pay transparency and agree what's right for your organisation. So you need to think about your reward philosophy. How is reward working in your organisation? Where does transparency fit in? How is it going to work in practice? What do you actually need to do? And involve your senior team in reviewing pay ranges and setting policy, because when they're involved and they understand the inputs, they're far more likely to trust it. And we also need to show them how we're going to help them, support them to manage tricky situations. But our leaders are just the start. Actually, if we really want to land pay transparency, it's our managers we need to be talking to. And there's a bit of a gap between the senior leadership team and employees, and those managers bridge that gap, and we know that employee experience is greatly influenced by our managers. But there's lots of data that shows that we're not particularly effective in preparing our managers to have these conversations, and there are some aspects that make it particularly tricky. You know, maybe they have incomplete information, or maybe there are historical anomalies that need addressing. I've talked about this before, but pay is really emotive. Our worth becomes very tangled up in pay because we believe it's how our organisations value us individually. So it makes these conversations very emotional and personal. So we've got to help our managers navigate these challenges. So practically, we need to share the context with them. We need to help them to understand what's the legislation, what's the reward frameworks in our organisation, and how pay decisions are made, so they all speak the same language. Data can really help, so sharing pay ranges or market data, or at least being able to explain to them what factors are taken into pay decisions so that they understand if there are differences in pay, what might be causing that. And we also need to help them to have challenging conversations. Everyone's going to cringe at this, but role play can be really helpful to practice, having some of those difficult questions or explaining tricky reward structures. But the actual level of transparency you go with is going to vary from organisation to organisation. So these questions will help you to start thinking about what is it we actually want to share, and what do I want my managers and my employees to have the answers to? So what do you need to do now? So the timeline for reporting. So back to the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Remaining countries are not going to have very long to share their proposals and to transpose the law into their local countries. So there's going to probably be quite a lot of noise in the next few months coming out from different countries. So you need to sort of keep your eyes and ears open, see what's going on. 2025 is going to be the last year in terms of pay review cycle that you'll have to close any gaps before the legislation comes into force. So in the meantime, these are just some of the areas that you can be focusing on to meet those requirements. And I think whatever the ask, there's one question that you need to be able to answer. And that's, if you've got differences in your total reward offer, are you comfortable that you can explain them justifiably? So the next steps you need to take very much depends on where you are now as an organisation and where you need to get to. And the journey will probably look different depending on whether you are a startup or a young organisation, or whether you're more established and have legacy structures, because that's going to very much impact the agility and the ability to remedy any gaps that you've got in your organisation. And we'll talk about that in a moment with our two panellists. So the core things that you need to be thinking about now. Create awareness amongst your senior stakeholders. So identify what impact legislation is going to have for your organisation and start to plan accordingly. Look at your data. So what additional data are you going to need for calculating and reporting some newer requirements? So whether that's in the UK, and we're talking about ethnicity and disability reporting, or whether it's under the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and we've got to think more broadly about pay in terms of the benefits that we're offering and pensions. Where are you going to get that data from? It might be that it's coming from different sources as well. If you can, start to do some analysis now, so start to look at your total gaps and make sure that your reward structures that you've got in place are robust. If you've got differences in eligibility or opportunity, can they be explained by objective, gender-neutral reasons? And start to think about creating an action plan now. So what needs to be addressed and what action do you need to be taking to close that gap? As I've already said, you need to be increasing education for managers and employees. And again, that doesn't have to be everything all in one go. But if we're thinking about this over the long term, how do you start to drip feed out those messages and start to build confidence in the organisation? And finally, start to track the impact of any initiatives that you're putting in place. And as I said, monitor what's going on in the space in terms of the countries putting their local legislation into effect. It's easy to think of 2026 as a goal, but actually it's just one point on a continual change management journey. So keep the curve in mind, because we're on a bit of a pay transparency roller coaster. Thank you.